Howdy, folks. It is I, the Solo Gamer, back again with a little bit more Polymega goodness, and this time I've gotten my hands on a few more Sega Genesis classics. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at what I've recently gotten my hands on, as well as one special arrival from the land of the rising sun. But first, we'll go ahead and look at what is routinely considered one of the Genesis's most unique licensed games ever, the Genesis version of the Aladdin game series. Now, granted, Aladdin only had like a couple of iterations on different consoles. And while the Super Nintendo is routinely considered to be the more visually and audibly appealing, many people prefer the gameplay of the Genesis version. Yeah. I think at this point, if you don't know the story of Aladdin, you need to get caught up on that. But what made this game different was its preferred use of combat as its primary method of play. It's also routinely noted to be incredibly challenging. Which, to be fair, that was not uncommon at this time in the industry. That was all too common, in fact. But the game was well regarded for being exceptionally good, both in terms of its overall gameplay and for being shockingly good visually. Now, granted, it was, for its time well considered by many to be arguably one of the better games in the industry, especially on the Genesis, which was it also did its best to make proper use of the soundtrack and visual style of the Disney film. Though, again, the Super Nintendo version inherently had a much, much better audio system, so it naturally had a much better audio quality. It just did. That is an undeniable fact. Didn't change the fact that the game was still, by all accounts, an excellently well-made game. But it was exceptionally difficult. It was, thankfully, relatively generous with checkpoints, if not with the, whoa. Nice try. It was very generous with the checkpoints, if maybe not perhaps with the, overall say, fairness. Still, it did pretty good for its time. And I do think gameplay-wise, it's definitely the more straightforward and but yeah, it is a product of its era, and it's very much I definitely would recommend it as a part of any Genesis collection. But it's not really what I'm here about. Next on the list was one of the other little weird bits of esoteric I got. Now, I have the Super Nintendo Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, which notably does not work on Polymega because of a graphical issue. I mean, it works, but the graphics are broken. This is the Genesis version, which is essentially a straight-up one-on-one fighting game, where you can play as the Rangers, and each of them has their own unique fighting style. But like many of the fighting games of its era, because it had to take into account the 3-button controls on the Genesis itself, it was fairly limited. This did not change the fact that the game was still pretty fun, but it wasn't exactly going to win any awards. It's also notable that the game is notably far less visually impressive than its Super Nintendo counterparts, especially when compared to the glory that was the Fighting Edition on the Super Nintendo. But if you don't have any other options, or if you were just looking for a Power Rangers fix on the Genesis, well, this is a decent variant. Not to say it's going to win any awards for being a champion grade game or anything like that, but it's still pretty fun. And each of the Rangers is unique in their own style. The red is a swordsman and all that, but all of them have a unique weapon or two in their arsenal, but they all fight in generally the same way. And then of course you get your Megazord battle. But yeah, it's not gonna win any awards compared to its counterpart. The one thing the Super Nintendo always had over the Genesis was far better audio and video capacity, and that was in many ways because Sega rushed to market. They took whatever they could get their hands on at the time, rather than waiting for the technology. It's funny because Nintendo typically was always like a generation behind its contemporaries until the Super Nintendo, and that's when it took a massive leap forward. Then, of course, Sega tried to counteract that with the Sega CD and the 32X, and Nintendo would, of course, respond with the N64, but then also PlayStation and Xbox would hit the market. And that would upend everything. Plus, of course, the era of the Dreamcast and the Saturn and all that, but yeah, like you can pick different Rangers and they each fight fairly similar. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. It is a bog standard simple fighting game with a very limited set. If you want a real fighting game, this is where you'd be coming. Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition. And it is notable that this was a big coup for Sega. For years, the Nintendo had the original Street Fighter II. And then out of nowhere, Sega comes out and says, "Oh, look, we've got the Championship Edition." And then, of course, a little while later, the Super Nintendo would have the Hyper Edition, and it would just keep going. Nowadays, you can get this game on just about anywhere. But this was, at the time, shocking that they could pull this off. But you will notice that there is a lot less activity in the backgrounds. The animation is a little bit more stiff and stunted. A lot of that is due to the limitations of the hardware. But the fact that they pulled this off at all is a massive, massive dub for Sega and Capcom. Unfortunately, it would be like an example of how Nintendo and Sega were always chasing each other's tails. Because Nintendo would do something. like Street Fighter Alpha 2 would be on the Super Nintendo. And Sega would do something. They'd get some big name publisher to put something out on the Genesis. And it was a back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, with Sega often aiming to get the arcade stuff if it could, whereas Nintendo would explicitly have stuff developed for the console. It was PlayStation that sort of broke the mold on that by being able to do anything it wanted thanks to the power of CD-ROMs. You basically had no limitation except storage space and hardware capacity, which unfortunately is what doomed the N64. The N64 was the most powerful machine on the market, and they went with cartridges, and that crippled it. I was actually having a conversation with some friends of mine who were all big into retro gaming, and we actually brought up the Wii as like, hey, what was the Wii U's? What was the Wii and the Wii U's deal? And I said they were experiments. They were Nintendo attempting to prove that motion technology was viable, and in the end, what they proved is that it has its use, but it is not a solution. It is a gimmick. And I know people will be like, but it made so much money for Nintendo. Yes, and no one else. No one but Nintendo came out of that in profit. In fact, there's a reason why most developers walked away from Nintendo in the Wii era and didn't start coming back until the Switch. And even then, if you compare the Switch's third-party support to, say, the PlayStation or the Xbox, there is a gap, a gulf, a chasm between them. And that is all down to the fact that, at a practical level, the Super Nintendo was a stepping stone, but the PlayStation was the opening of a floodgate. And then the Wii and the Wii U were steps backward. Now, that being said, the Wii and the Wii U both had some immensely good games. Particularly the Wii U, being much more powerful than the Wii, could do a lot more, but it was still limited because of the touchscreen. And that's Nintendo's biggest flaw, is that they are always seeking to innovate, but they sometimes forget that innovation does not always mean improvement. And that's like, the Wii was an experiment, but the only people who came out of that with anything to show for it was Nintendo. And that was way more to do with Nintendo's innate desire to innovate and develop on their terms, as opposed to innovating and developing on, say, the terms of another company, like, as an example, just to put this out there, but you look at what happened with the PlayStation 4, it had pretty much third-party support from everybody on the goddamn planet. Generally speaking, if you developed games, you developed for the PlayStation 4. But the PlayStation 4 was also a system that was not keeping up with the times. It was still technologically behind them. So it was always a game of catch-up. The PlayStation 5 ameliorated some of that, but it was still a race to the top with terms of technology. But as the price of development increased, you saw less and less games, and that's why we're in the conundrum we are now, where there's less and less games at the higher levels and more at the lower levels at the indie level, because it's just more affordable. Anyway, on to Road Rash. Road Rash is a perfect example of a game that I think you could do today that would be absolutely just phenomenal. You wouldn't have to spend a whole lot of money on it. Put some time into the bikes, the racers, and the tracks. Make sure the sense of speed is good. All that kind of stuff. But I mean, beyond that, it really isn't all that complex. But Road Rash was a unique game in that it took the concept of a racing game and said, what if we added combat? And Road Rash 2 is widely regarded as one of the best in its era. It had a good sense of speed. The movement was smooth and fairly consistent, even if the bike did drift a little bit more than it should, but it played well. And I've got many a version of Road Rash, including the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 version. PlayStation and, like, I think I've got like a Sega Saturn version or something. I got a couple of versions, I forget which, but there was like 3 different variants of this on the PS1. But like the whole thing about Road Rash was it was a fun game, both solo or with other players. But like the PlayStation was where it really had its moment because of the split screen option. Oh crap! I wiped out. When you wipe out, you gotta run back to your bike and get back on. But yeah, Road Rash was an interesting game in and of itself. But it would go on to spawn like many racing action games, and I think you can sort of credit this to what would eventually become like the Twisted Metal series and stuff like that. But it wasn't perfect. Like no doubt about that. It had its flaws. But it was a great little game, and especially if you loved racing and action games, it was fantastic. But we're here for this. This is the game I went to the map for to get my hands on. Forgotten Worlds was an arcade legend. And granted, Capcom's port of it to the Genesis was functional, if not perfect. But Forgotten Worlds was a perfect example of a game that took all the sort of standardized stuff and just said, let's make this as simple as we possibly can. And just make it be as fun and as straight out action focused as possible. Was it perfect? No. It was really rudimentary, super simple, and I don't think you could ever argue that it was without its flaws, but it was a ton of fun to play. If a bit difficult. Okay, a lot difficult, I'm sorry. What made the game stand out and what made it legendary for its time was the sheer variety of different weapons, the sheer amount of different gear you could wield, the sheer unrelenting pace of it. It's actually, I remember this game was a quarter killer in the arcade. You just burned quarters trying to beat this crap in the arcade. And that wasn't to say it was at all bad. It was just what it was. Like, you just did what you could. But I enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun with it back in the day. And the game continues to be an excellent game even to this day. But that's not to say it's without its flaws. It's difficult. Can have some serious jank and bullshit. But at the end of the day, it's still one of the best shooters for the system ever produced, and it's honestly the sheer speed and intensity of it made it worth playing. Though I will be the first to admit, I don't know that I've ever straight out beaten this game. Like, I remember playing it, I remember getting pretty deep into it, I don't remember ever actually defeating it. Zenny. That was the Japanese universal currency, I suppose. But yeah, the game is, it is a very fast-paced, very action-heavy, very challenging game with just sheer numbers is the problem. Like, you will spend an absolutely ridiculous amount of time just trying to survive. But yeah, the game does allow you to upgrade and buy weapons and different equipment. You can get stronger weaponry and firepower. It has a lot of really good, if somewhat standardized features for its era. But I would say, yeah, in terms of just practical, entertainment, this game was top tier. And of course, on something like the Polymega, you can save state it and play it whenever you want, which makes it really handy. But it is definitely top rank on my board, and one I know I'm going to pour enormous amounts of time into. Still waiting for some 32X stuff to arrive. I've got it shipping in. When it gets here, I'll put it on a video for you. And then of course I've still got my TurboGrafx stuff, but I wanted to show you something. I picked up another piece from the Ranma 1/2 series for the TurboGrafx CD. Actually, technically PC Engine CD in Japan. And this was one I actually physically had another variant of that I could never get to work because you had to have a card and a CD to make this one work, I think. Because there's a lot of Ranma 1/2 games on this system. I could have sworn I set the virtual display to this for widescreen. That's alright. But unlike the previous one, which was a... Unlike the previous one, which was a... Which was designed to be a very... It was supposed to be a sort of... It was supposed to be sort of like a fighting game. And this was designed to be a side-scrolling beat-em-up, but as you can tell, this was so early on in the game series, in the series for the hardware, I think they kind of didn't have a choice, really. It also was notorious for having awful hit detection. But yeah, I remember trying to play this thing and figure it out, and it was just so hard. In part because there was a malfunction in the version I had where the floor didn't even load, so you died instantly. At least with this one, the actual ground loads. But as you can tell by the scrolling issue in the background, this game's actual functions were kind of messed up. That being said, it does work. Like, the game is actually playable, which is something I could not get the last time. I don't care if you're a bear, I'm still gonna fight you. I think this is supposed to be his training at the Forbidden Springs or whatever. But yeah, as you can tell, this game definitely has problems in its software. And unfortunately, like, this was common with a lot of these early games on the PC Engine. They were meant to run with certain systems in place, and I don't know that I have them all. I know the Polymega supports them, but I think one of the things I'm actually missing is the Mega card that's supposed to go with this. But anyway. But yeah, I'm slowly building up a compilation of all the stuff I had in the original, but Honestly, if you're looking for the Ranma 1/2 games, the best ones are still here on the Super Nintendo. Just like just like the just like they were back in my youth, they're still available pretty much anywhere. But as this system grows, the collection it supports gets bigger and bigger. For example, one of the best games ever made was this one, and this is Crusader No Remorse. Now I can say that if you have a PC, this is available on PC on like eight different platforms now. It's super readily available on GOG, on EA, on a dozen other things. So getting it's not hard. No, I could have sworn I set the virtual display. Huh. I guess that is display. Okay, yeah. Now, unfortunately, one of the biggest problems with this version of the game, and if I ever get my hands on the on the PS1 version, might just show it to you on the PC version, is that this game did not have the original music for the game, which unfortunately I think that's a huge mistake because the original music for the game is fucking phenomenal. But at least especially the main menu screen. Unfortunately, one of the biggest problems with these games was, and I say this as someone who has played the PC, the Super Nintendo, but a lot of the problem with this game, a lot of the problem with this game is all down to its controls. And unfortunately, like, this is a problem that was prevalent with a lot of the, yeah, see, that's absolute controls, which the problem being, one of the things you're supposed to be able to do is you're supposed to be able to directly interact with objects in the environment. You can't do that with this thing's control setup. I don't know why it's like this. It just is. And unfortunately, like, that's actually a secondary effect from the Saturn's controllers being woefully, woefully woefully under designed for that kind of thing. It works for some stuff. It works for a lot of these games, but it doesn't work for others. And that's unfortunately, like, that's a side effect of the platform itself having very serious limitations. But yeah, like if you look here, I have all these games, and yet I at one point had Crusader No Remorse on the PS1, and I don't know what I did with my copy of it. It's gone. I'll have to run a copy down again. But I can show you the PC version, which at least I know works, but I'll do that some other day when I'm in the mood for doing some more PC retro game stuff. But yeah, the Polymega is fully compatible with a ton of Genesis games. In fact, the database for the Genesis library is huge. I mean, look at this. And it is enormous. There is so much here that you could dig into. So it's definitely worth picking up. Though I would say there's some games on here that are definitely worth the time, and many another that wouldn't be worth the effort at all. But that's the thing. And like with a lot of the controllers, they cross over into different platforms because you can play these games with a Sega controller because they only need two buttons. On the other hand, the Super Nintendo, you could play that with the 6-button controller because it would work, but you'd have to remap it. Gradius. That's still the best box art. If not the pinnacle of why I love old school box art back in the day. But like Cabal was a great game you could play back in the day. Very simple, very straightforward. There was actually an arcade game called Blood Brothers, very similar to this. But yeah, the systems are all pretty compatible. And the general controller, the universal controller, which I do have, works with everything. You just have to remap the controls as you go along. For example, let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's say you and a buddy want to play, but you only have one of the Sega controllers. Well, you can go into controllers and turn them both on. And now you have two controllers. But let's say you only want to use one. Well, you only need one then. Turn the other one off, and off you go, back to your business. And this one will take over and completely take control of the system now. So if I wanted to play Genesis games with this one, I certainly can. It's fully compatible. Same with Sega CD, same with 32X, same with these. It's just a matter of figuring out what controls you have on a given game. Now here's a little something I don't know if I've mentioned. This is a game that a lot of people don't know about, especially if they're not like hardcore Dragon Ball fans. But there's two variants of this. There's the PlayStation version and the Saturn version, and they're both unique. It's called, in America it was called, in Japan it was known as Ietsu Densetsu or some nonsense like that. But yeah, Idirano Dragon Ball Densetsu. Basically Dragon Ball Z The Legends. But they were different in each variant, with the Saturn version being much simpler in design, but playing more or less the same. But the PlayStation version took advantage of the PlayStation's hardware and made good use of it. So let's go ahead and load the save state. And if I'm really having to explain the Dragon Ball story to you at this point, really? Do I really need to explain that to you at this juncture? And I will give it this. I will say that the Saturn version's load times are vastly superior. I do not know why. They just are. But let's say you're going to start this fight with these three. The characters you pick will rush onto the screen, dive in, and immediately join the fight. Now here's the thing. On the Saturn version, changing these characters was very hard because of the limited button configuration. On the PlayStation version, far easier. Also, of course, it's a Japanese game, all Japanese language, yada yada, you get the idea. But you gotta keep in mind, this never came to America. This was legend in America back in the day, when all we got was the final bout and the Ultimate Battle 22 nonsense. But what made this game stand out was it was the first game of its kind to really like. It was like the first game of its kind to really sort of make you feel like you were playing Dragon Ball. The biggest problem being that the controls took a lot of getting used to, and a lot of people did not know how they worked. Once you figured them out, you could do all kinds of cool stuff. And your team also works as a group, so... But let's say you want to switch over to Vegeta. Well, on the Saturn, there was this really convoluted control system to do that. On the PlayStation, you literally just hit one of the buttons, and it transfers it over. But yeah, working as a team is pretty much essential to winning this fight. Now, you can actually replicate the story mode by having Krillin go up against Frieza alone and get killed. And if he does, Goku will go Super Saiyan and that's that. But either way, the whole point of this is to do as much damage to the opponent as you can. Now, one thing that was unique about this was that you could not, in the Saturn version, interrupt a combo the way you can here. Which made the Saturn version a lot easier to beat, because the combos, once you got them started, were almost uninterruptible from the outside. You could only counter them with the playable character you were using. But basically, the whole point is to shift the power balance all the way to you, and then once you shift the power balance all the way to you, you get the Cinemax Super Attack. Now, mind you, this game did not follow the storyline perfectly. It did take some liberties because the game had limited resources and could not do all the different stuff it wanted, but it was super easy to just basically go to town on the bad guys and build up power as much as possible, and then once you did enough damage, you would just pop off with a super move. And if you drained your opponent's power and then kept the pressure up, you could keep on them and just keep going after them till they ran out of juice, and then pounded them again, over and over and over again. The higher the difficulty, the higher the level, the more the enemy will resist or try to break out. But if you knew how to play, you could do this and just keep on juggling. So yeah, like, the game did an admirable job of trying to recreate the Dragon Ball Z fighting, feel, trying to feel like the anime. Not exactly a good fighting game per se, but a decent enough Dragon Ball game, and certainly standing out for its time, of course. But it was a product of its era, and a lot of that boils down to, Dragon Ball was huge at the time. There's a lot of desire and popularity for it, but there wasn't really a whole lot of... No one had a good idea of how to make that work. So... But yeah, the Polymega continues to be one of my favorite systems. And I do think it's going to be one of the coolest things ever. I just want to really quickly show you its power-up screen, so you can see for yourself just how this bad boy looks. Pardon the test screen while the system reboots. I will say, the Polymega does have a relatively long boot-up cycle. It is slow. But once it loads, everything else loads and runs very efficiently. You get the Polymega screen, Takes a few moments to cycle in and load up your memory and storage systems, and then once it loads up, you're in and ready to roll immediately, and you can get right to work playing whatever you want. And because it is so universally supported, you can basically play whatever you want right from the get-go. Like I said, I've got the Saturn version of Densetsu as well. Got Darius, Darklight, Daytona, all in here. I can just hop in and play. And go play what few TurboGrafx games I've got, which, admittedly, don't have as many as I'd like. They are very expensive. But I've got a few. I'm slowly getting a collection of TurboGrafx CD games, starting with the Ranma, some Neo Geo, and of course, my beloved PlayStation collection, which is the heart and soul of my collection. But yes, this is, for lack of a better word, in my opinion, the definitive platform for retro gaming. Anything from Final Fantasy Tactics to Ghost in the Shell to Gauntlet Legends to Forsaken, Gundam Battle Assault. There's a blast from my past. This actually got re-released in America as Gundam Battle Assault, but in Japan it's from the same people who do Earth Defense Force. The Simple 2000 series is actually the people who made this in Japan. As crazy as that is, right? But like, there was a huge Gundam was huge back then, so they thought, all right, well, let's see if we can get the license.
Gundam Battle Assault 2.
And the fact that it is so cheap is why I think the actual yeah, and see, I don't have any. Yeah, let's restart the game. I think I've got save states in the system, but like the whole Simple 2000 thing is hilarious. Everybody knows about Earth Defense Force. What most people don't know is that it was one part of a huge series of games in Japan, all called the Simple 2000 series.
Loading system settings and game progress properly.
Yeah. But the Simple 2000 series is a huge, and I mean huge, series in Japan. And it sort of spun off from... from a simple series of card and tabletop games like Mahjong that then spun off into other franchises and would eventually become what we know now as like the Sandlot D3 combo. But yeah, they go back for... God, they went back for hundreds of... for hundreds of games. They were the... But they go back to hundreds of games, all the way back to like the... I know they had some Super Nintendo stuff, but the PlayStation was really when they took off. It is notable that I do think they were able to get the actual voice cast from the English version of Gundam in that. But like, this was part of just the Simple 2000 series. It was one of many games they released in the era. And it's funny to me that so many people were like, oh, Earth Defense Force, such a great game. It's like, you have no idea where it originated from or how it got its start. It was part of one series of Simple 2000 games that came out in the early PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 era that would eventually turn into the franchise we know now. But I always thought that was hilarious. But yeah, the Polymega is a beast of a machine for retro gaming purposes. But it's the characteristic that makes it unique is that it isn't some half-baked, rip-off where you have to, you're loading ROMs and crap. This uses all the original hardware, CD-ROMs and everything. All the games you see listed here, I have physical copies of. Which is why I'm actually looking for my No Regret for the PlayStation, because it was the actual best version of that game I ever played. Hard, but still the best. Anyway, but for now, I'm gonna let you all go. This is arguably the longest retro video I think I've made in a while, but I definitely think that the Polymega is going to be the standout for the retro gaming scene going forward if more people find out about it. Because while it is expensive, its sheer versatility makes it practically a goldmine. And yes, it is expensive. Yes, each of the modules is pricey. But you can't beat a system that can do everything. And unlike other systems which can be ethically dubious, looking at you, Retron, but this system's authentic. It's got full licensing and everything. So, anyway, this is a Solo Gamer, and I will see you all back here for some more retro games when my 32X compilation comes in. I've got a couple of 32X packages coming in. But I will see you all then. Solo Gamer signing out.